Good evening, everyone. Myself, Ashutosh Kumar Thakur, on behalf of Kalinga Literary Festival, I welcome you all in today's Bhava Samvad. So, in today's Bhava Samvad, we have a renowned panel with us, Sukrita Kumar Paul ji, Deepa Agarwal ji, Professor Mala Srilal ji, and Sangeeta Gupta ma'am. So, we have four eminent panel with us in today's Bhava Samvad. So, this is a 1 hour session, and I would like to request Mala Lal ma'am to take this conversation forward. Welcome, Malasri ma'am. Please take this forward.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a very great pleasure to be part of this session and to be moderating the discussion on Deepa Agarwal's new book of poems, which is called Forgotten Kaleidoscopes. I have with me two eminent poets along with Deepa, and the book is a beautiful one. Congratulations, Deepa. And really looking forward to what we are going to be talking about. So, Deepa, I want to start with you because it's unusual to come up with a book of poems at this stage when you're so very well known as a writer for children and for young adults. And most of us who've known you closely didn't know that in your secret bower, you were actually composing poetry as well. And there is indeed a kind of magic about the poetry that you have put together. There is a sense of wonder on one hand, and on the other, it's an extremely mature, sophisticated treatment of the experiences of life. So, first of all, very warm congratulations on this wonderful book. And my question is about the transition that you're making from writing stories for a different age group to now writing not only for yourself, but for an adult audience. So, what do you think was the impetus for this? Or was it always a parallel existence, being two kinds of writers? So, I want to elaborate just a little by way of introductory remarks as to what I found very compelling about your poems. There is a great deal on the theme of memory, and it comes in one way or the other throughout this collection. I'm reading for the benefit of the audience some lines that struck me as particularly deep and empathetic on this theme. And yet it is I who tell tales now, fishing in that timeless sea of the past, finding old shoes, a rotted corpse, but sometimes a pearl within an oyster. So, that poem, Pearl Within an Oyster, and the image is exactly what I mean about the sense of wonder and the sense of experience coming together. And you have created a kind of a life narrative for yourself through this book, if I may say so. And it's personal, but it's also embedded in the cultural. And I'm just going to quote four lines from a poem that appears in the section called Cityscapes, because that's the public avenue where you're locating your poems as well. Here are the lines. Every morning, Neruda, I see blood flowing through the Delhi streets, bodies crumpled like paper bags to feed a giant incinerator. Very strong, powerful, difficult imagery that you attribute to the conditions of living in a city. So, back to my original question. Though the poems were written individually, perhaps over a long period of time, what motivated the publication of Forgotten Kaleidoscopes?
Thank you so much, Mal, for your kind words. Well, you know, uh, you asked me if it's a transition, but actually, as you put it, it has been a parallel existence along with my children's writing. From my childhood, I've been a poetry lover, and through my growing years, my adult life, I've always been a keen reader of poetry. And something that distillation of emotion, the way, through poetry you can put forward something briefly and yet sharply, that is always, you know amazed me, and how, poetry lingers in your mind for years and years. Like, you could remember the poems that you read in your childhood, those stray quotations, stay with you. So actually, all the while when I've been writing stories for children, I've also been writing poetry. Not a lot of poetry. My output is small, but I have been, publishing in journals, etc. And actually, I did have a collection out about 15 years back where Sukrita incidentally spoke, and Sangeeta also attended the launch. So this has actually been a parallel existence. And the thing is, one of the reasons is there's certain things, you cannot express in children's fictions. There's certain reactions. Like, for example, how would you express the horror that you feel reading about an incident of rape? How would you vent that horror in a children's story? And poetry, I felt, is the best vehicle for such reactions, such emotions. So that is where my poetry has come from. All the things that I cannot say in my children's fiction, of course, all writing is a form of communication. There are issues that bring up in children's fiction, but I cannot put certain things into children's fiction like that. And as you rightly say, this is a kind of, well, when I was reading through the poems, when I was doing the proofreading, it suddenly struck me, this is like a poetic memoir, because these are all based on memory. Not all, but many of the poems are based on memory. And actually, for a moment, it struck me, am I revealing too much? Because somehow you are less restrained in poetry. But but I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to put all these poems together, because they were scattered. I had that earlier collection, but as it happens, it went out of print, and the poems were there in journals and scattered, jotted down in various diaries. And for the last 2, 3 years, I've been thinking I must put all this output together. So I have a book, and I can see, in a sense, it's actually my poetic journey that I have compiled. And thanks so much for your kind words. I'm so happy to know that you enjoyed reading my work, and you had such kind words to say. Thanks a lot. Sound.
Of a poetic work from a fellow poet has a very, very special perspective. And Sukrita, in your case, you are, of course, a very accomplished poet. And of course, you're also very well known as an academic, a translator, an editor. You've just come out with a wonderful anthology on Indian poetry, the yearbook. So, in your journey, Sukrita, the various genres and expressions within it have been simultaneous and not sequential. In that kind of a situation, the play of memory becomes somewhat different from what Deepa is talking about. Because when you've written academically about the partition, it is not just about memory, but the evolution of memory, how memory itself changes, or what Toni Morrison called rememorizing. And yet, when you're talking as a poet, a different kind of a play of memory seems to happen. And talking again about the context of some of Deepa's work in child imagination, you have poems about your childhood in Kenya. And some of it are reminiscing poems, some of it are poems of anxiety, some of them are very mystical in the way they reach out. So, do you think that poetry is a kind of autobiography, whether one does that consciously or not? And whether it's in one volume like Deepa's or in multiple instances expressed in your work, what is your thoughts about the link between poetry and autobiography?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very pertinent question because while poetry does dig deep into personal experience, and in Deepa's poetry, while she says, well, have I revealed myself too much? Because there is that anxiety of recognition of experiences that she may have had, which she recognizes, but we don't. That's the beauty of it. We don't recognize those experiences as her private, personal experiences. And I think, as the well known critic T.S. Eliot said, it's a journey, the creative process is a journey from the personal to the impersonal. And I think the moment your personal recollections leave the domain of being uh, just mere diary writing, where you are just pouring out everything as it was to some extent, as it's possible, as much as it's possible. But this is more than diary. We don't recognize Deepa here, we recognize a poet, right? And I think the poem, if it were not to become her poem, if it were not to become my poem and yours, then she's not successful. So the idea of it becoming impersonal, and yet the trigger of point may be an actual experience, right? And that trigger of point, if one, as a critic, if I put on my critic's hat and if I start digging into her personal life and say, okay, where is the source? Then every poem will have a source somewhere in actuality. And then it becomes a kind of an autobiography. But it's a very metaphorical autobiography. Every poem in itself is a metaphor. It's a whole metaphor. It's not series of metaphors in one poem, though that has a different function if one is using metaphors. But the whole poem is a kind of a metaphor for something that she actually experienced, and she finds a whole, or I find, or anybody else finds, a particular set of images, which uh, the whole of it becomes a metaphor. And so, in that sense, yes, it's an autobiography, but an autobiography with a difference. It's not memoirs, merely memoirs either. It's not a diary. It's not memoirs, but it goes beyond this. Something called aesthetics that has come into it. And it's that aesthetic process which I think one needs to understand as to how she has gone about. She said venting. She used the word venting of, say, a rape scene or something that she may have witnessed or heard about, which has moved the poet so much, and you want to write about it. But it becomes something else in the process of writing. It will not be exactly the horror that she may have experienced while listening to the story as it was. So the process would change it. The writing of it would change it. And then at the end, yes, what Mala, you very beautifully put it, that sense of wonder that the poet himself or herself has at the end of the poem. You start with the sense of wonder and you end up with the sense of wonder. And I really enjoyed particularly the whole section of memory tremendously, because she calls it the cage of memory. It's a cage of memory released in poetry. The memories are released out of the cage, as it were. And so there is a sense of freedom. And if I may use the word, even exorcising. Some kind of an exorcising, the process of exorcising happens. And so it is for the whole world then. It's not personal memory then. So it's not history writing. It's not even historical content for yourself. It is something that is in the now. The past filtered through the now. And so the poem becomes very vibrant and throbs in the now, in this moment. And if it were not to, then it would be something else, not a poem. That's the aesthetic process, I think, that we are talking about.
Thanks very much, Sukrita, for particularly focusing on the idea of poetry as metaphor and the role of memory. I'm now going to turn to Sangeeta, another remarkable career, another wonderful poet, and your trajectory has been absolutely fantastic, Sangeeta. From being a
Thank you.
career bureaucrat in income tax, you have come to be known very widely as a poet, a filmmaker, an artist, and a curator. So, when you're reading Deepa's book, Forgotten Kaleidoscopes, what strikes you as significantly similar or dissimilar to your own diverse work? And again, I'm going to add a little footnote. Personally, I find that both of you are quite wonderstruck by the beauty of nature, but not nature as something out there, but nature as it is linked to human relationships and human experience. So that it's an interpretive view of nature. I was looking at your recent book, and you say there that in crossing seven seas and thousands of miles to touch the moist morning soil of my city. Now, this kind of understanding of what that moist soil means to the senses of a poet is very different from describing the soil and the rain. So that's what I mean about the human empathy and link with nature. Now, Deepa, in a similar or a parallel kind of a way, has a striking poem about a woman on the road to Lhasa. And I'm just reading a line from there. Only when night's black tent enfolds the enemy sun can I breathe. So I think we would be interested in Sangeeta if you could comment some more on such elements of environmental images in your poem and also Deepa's.
Right. First of all, I have been reading Deepa's poems since long because her first book is still with me. When it was launched, I got it autographed and bought it because that's the way a poet should greet and celebrate the other poet. And I have known Deepa since many years. I think maybe more than 15, 16, 17 years when she was translating Chitra Mudgal's book. Since then we interacted. I have been to her house. So for me to read the second book after a long gap, she was writing, but to read the poems in a collection is a different experience altogether. You read one poem, two poem, but if you read all the poems together in a collection, somehow I feel it, the experience is different. So I was just wondering how Deepa as a writer, as a poet, as a human being has evolved through these years, in last 20 years. So it was, I always knew that दीपा एक बहुत ठहरी हुई औरत है. इसको हिंदी में इसलिए बोल रही हूँ बिकॉज मुझे इंग्लिश में ठहरी हुई औरत नहीं समझ में आता. सो शी इज अ वेरी वेरी calm, composed person. And poetry, when a person like her, I am a very impulsive person, very passionate. I go by the flow. मेरा personality थोड़ा उस type का है. But then I thought Deepa is a very very calm and composed person. I have never seen her deviating from the particular discipline path. So for me to understand and to see her journey was very important. I almost read the whole book because I like to read poetry while I'm about to sleep. So if I read 4 or 5 poems, it's always a good feeling. So I have gone through all the poems, especially the poems which she has written about the girl child, which really was so intense that it moved me. So I feel that Deepa also has a social concern. If she didn't have that kind of a strong social concern for people, she wouldn't have been writing for children, for adolescents. So, if somebody is writing for children, it is a very demanding job. To get into the shoe of a child and to understand the psyche of a child and write, I cannot do it. I can write for a teenager who is in love, but I cannot write for a child. It is the most difficult thing to understand and put yourself there and then understand the psyche and write. So Deepa is a multi-dimensional writer. In her inner self, she is a poet, which she doesn't want many people to know. That's why she was, she did not do all that, because maybe she was too preoccupied. I always thought, when I read her first book, I always thought that why Deepa's new collection is not coming. Because when you put your whole energy and your intense experiences into a different genre, poetry doesn't come. Suppose I am into a big project and I am doing a painting, I can't write poetry. Those days I am totally barren poet. I don't write. And if I'm making a film, then again I can't write. Poetry comes only when you allow. It comes like a mistress. Deepa says that it doesn't knock the door, it doesn't ask your permission, it comes. And you can't say no to a poem. So that kind of a relationship is there between a poem and a poet. And that is common between all of us. It must be common for Sukrita, for Deepa, and me, and for you as well. When a poem comes, it doesn't need anybody's permission, or it doesn't want you to, it needs all your attention at that particular point of time. For me, and maybe for Deepa also, when we are moved by something and then we write, then it is a catharsis, as well as putting your own passion, intensity, all your emotions in one particular place. Poetry becomes a very intense piece for the writer, for the poet, and then when it is shared by with others, when it goes in the public domain, uh, then I always feel that the same kind of experiences, people always tell me that, I also wanted to say this, but you have said I'm not able to say all this. So that experience, I think, is common with all of us. Sukrita pinpointed that if it doesn't relate to others, people cannot relate to your poetry, then you are not a poet at all. You are not only speaking for yourself, you are speaking for the whole universe, in a way, a poetic universe. So that kind of relationship, a poem, poet, and a co-poet is also into that. Then again, when it comes to nature, Deepa comes from the hilly side. She comes from Uttarakhand, and of course, it is very, very close to her, that she will explain, or she will relate to nature. I also feel that even if I stand in my balcony and I see a butterfly or a bee or a small flower just blooming, it elates me like nothing else. So all poets, I think all people who are sensitive would relate to nature in some way or the other. We will imbibe that feeling, and convert that into a sentence or a word. And for me, when I read poetry, my problem is most of the time I'm also seeing it, because I'm an artist. I start seeing the visuals. I can see the visuals when I read something, and if it is very intense, then the visual also becomes very intense, and it is a different kind of an experience for a person. I think Sukrita will also agree with me that, even as a poet, you also have a visual language parallel going. You can see the visuals, you can see the visuals, you can see the visuals. So in a way, all of us would relate to what Deepa is saying, and that is the beauty of a poem. If it comes from Deepa after many years, or we didn't get to read a collection, and we are reading it after a long gap, doesn't matter. A poet is a poet.
I want to pick up that wonderful phrase about visual language, which Sangeeta you've used, and Sukrita by implication, because Sukrita is also an artist along with her poetry. To go back again to asking Deepa a couple of things, particularly about the title of the collection. Because yes, poetry comes without knocking, it comes unbidden. But when a poet brings a collection together, you have to think of a title. that's when I think the editor in a poet will have to come to the fore and said, okay, what is the binding image of this collection that I'm putting together? So, Deepa, what made you give this name Forgotten Kaleidoscope? Because kaleidoscope, and this relates to this visual image and uh, the inchoate ways in which poetry comes to us. These are pieces of glass and they're at the end of a tube. And because you shake it in a certain way, there are new patterns that form. So sometimes it seems to me that a kaleidoscope, one doesn't really have a perspective on what structure that glass will take. You're moving it, but you don't know what's going to happen. So it is as much something that is mobile as one is trying to grasp something that is permanently moving. So it's a very dynamic image, and I love that very much, Deepa. The title that you bring in, because it suggests the shifting perspectives, which is important. So I'm going to read a few lines from Deepa's poem, which is about this kind of a shifting perspective. A poem is a strange thing, sometimes exploding into life, whole, complete, perfect as a newborn babe. Sometimes carefully cut to measure, like a garment lovingly crafted, embellished, embroidered, and proudly worn. Sometimes an abscess, burgeoning, suppurating, then bursting open to spill its pain for all to view. So I really admire this kind of writing. As Sangeeta and Sukrita said, that words are out there for poets to choose. What ultimately lodges in the poetic imagination, one really doesn't know. So, Deepa, over to you. I would be interested in the explication of the title.
Well, it's interesting the way all of us have homed into, the randomness of the creative impulse. And definitely, that's very well said, that the perspectives keep shifting. And we just don't know from where the creative impulse is coming. I mean, it has taken root somewhere, but you don't know the moment when it's going to make its appearance. And when Kaleidoscope is something, I was thinking, it's the title poem, of course, and when I was thinking about a title for the book, it suddenly struck me that this has to be the title, because, as you say, the kaleidoscope keeps shifting and you don't know which pattern is going to emerge next. It's not in your power to control those patterns. And not only the creation of poetry, or in fact the progress of existence is to a great extent like that. And when people ask me, why did you decide to become a writer, I I come up with some explanation to satisfy them, but I always feel that it's very hard to find the exact answer to that, and I'm never satisfied that where did this impulse come from? Why do I have this need that to write, and why do I not write about, I stick to one particular uh, kind of theme or whatever, or genre, whatever. So uh, I have a section. You picked up the poem from that section, words, because this is the section in which all the poems. I'm wondering about the whole process of writing, why it happens. I don't want to sound too fanciful. It really feels mystical at times. It's out of your control, and you're very grateful that when a poem happens, you're really grateful about it. And then the whole thing about memory that you say, that there is memory and forgetting, both, as Sukrita also mentioned, that memory is always not really exactly as it was. So forgotten kaleidoscopes. These are, memories which are forgotten, and you are reliving them in a different manner. So there is both, uh, you know, the present and the past mingling. And you're looking back, it's like the kaleidoscope has shifted. It's not the image that you had seen, remembered when you moved it. And that is why, because there's so many memories in this book, I feel the kaleidoscope just keeps shifting and uh, bringing new shapes for me to look at and marvel over. And on the flippant side, I can even say that kaleidoscopes, as we knew them, are actually forgotten now, because children don't play with the kaleidoscopes any longer. I mean, they do things on their screens, some games and all that, but those pieces of glass which we used to find so fascinating as children, those are not, I don't see them around anymore. I mean, I don't see my grandchildren playing with them. So that is why, these different perspectives uh, are, as you say, scattered all over this collection. Like I have, the whole experience from childhood to maturity, and then to aging, in poems like menopause or old eyes. There's the experience of aging. Then from individual memory to public concerns, like imaginary snows, the concern for the environment, or even philosophical reflections, as in the train to somewhere, the train to nowhere. And then, this poem, Robin Island, that is, I visited Robin Island once, and there was something so heartrending and so ironical, because the man who was the guide had actually been a prisoner there. And it just, made my hair stand on end. And I said, look, literally, that's the last line of the poem. The lines of his palm have bound him to Robin Island. So, this is the kaleidoscope of life as I see it. And though the title really came to, hit me uh, by chance, but when the whole book is, taken as a whole, then I realized that, yes, these are forgotten kaleidoscopes. And I think I'd like to read the poem just to, you know, give an idea of how it connects. Because in this poem, I come from the general right down to the very personal. Forgotten kaleidoscopes. Cunningly, colors will sneak past the corner of your eye and stun it into stillness. Arch into hopeful rainbows, gleam like a palette of gems scattered by a scheming jeweler. Cunningly, they will wipe themselves out like a whimsical kaleidoscope in a child's hands. Who smashed all these glass spangles and poured the shards into a cylinder to entertain a child? Who planned the glittering patterns that shifted before my spellbound eyes? Were they gathered from frenzied wrists, shedding color? Because a woman's life must lose color without a man. How, no matter how many indifferent rainbows stain the sky. Dressing for Papa's funeral in a white sari, my Christian mother asks, what shall I do with these bangles? Four red glass bangles that absent-mindedly adorned her wrists. Break them, says her matter-of-fact friend. So So this is what it is, uh, you go back and forth, either from personal experience to the general, or from the general, you You begin a poem, and then suddenly you realize at the end, this has all come out from your own personal experience.
Deepa, and ask Sukrita to respond, because when you have all these poems about marginalized women, Sukrita too has a very fine eye for the humane experiences that mark our everyday lives. And Sukrita, you've written about homeless people, about childhood on the pavement. Recently, with the pandemic, you've picked up those images of horror that Deepa was just talking about. So, when it comes to such reflections coming through poetry for both of you and perhaps Anita, do you think, Sukrita, that poetry has a social purpose?
Of course, I think it has to be said that even if it is a very so-called personal anguish that finds its expression through a poem, um, the very inward journey that the process requires, the inward journey that a process of writing requires, I think it unveils a certain kind of churning and anguish, angst, existential angst that one feels about a situation. The situation is always external, but it gets located in the internal in the poem through the process. And this kind of the outward and the inward relationship that a poem builds up, the internal and the external, it bridges that particular point. And so from the individual, one moves onto the social plane, into the moving experiences that one sees out there, which are internalized. And I think all poetry is definitely built up in such a way that there is empathy with the outside in a very big way. And this empathy comes only because of this inward journey. I was thinking of, the image that keeps coming up in Deepa very poignantly, which is that of anarkali. I think 2 or 3 poems are actually, they bring out anarkali. And one of the images that she talks about, I may not be able to locate it now, but anarkali is basically, this whole idea of celebration of love on the one hand, and on the other, the way the song of love is getting tombed, And this tombing, the way it is done, so can one really look at that binary of sorrow and happiness, celebration and mourning? No, you can't. It's kind of so complex. The whole experience is so complex. And to my mind, it's been told so beautifully in the poem called Anarkali. It's a very simply told story in a way. And I think that's where Deepa's writing for the children must have helped her to narrate, in a poem, to narrate very delicately the story of Anarkali. And she picks up, obviously, the moments have been picked up. Now, this story is not a personal one. And one would say, what's social about it? It's the moment you align with it. And the moment the internal is exteriorized in a way, it's kind of, it finds expression outside of itself. That's what makes it also socially appealing. And so in that sense, I mean, I don't want to define social cause like a sociologist will. I want to define it like an artist will. So when an artist or a writer, when you are looking at what makes it of the other, and I'm going back in a way to what I had said earlier, not only is an anarkali's anguish of a kind that is coming through, or celebration, there's also an underlining point of history that comes through. Who was Anarkali? And the poem tells us it's a slave who dared to love. And I think that's very, very pertinent, that point. So it's just a delicate touch. She's not a sociologist. The poet is not a sociologist to record how this slave's love affair happened or whatever, but just a suggestion. The slave who dared to love. Now, that is only one line. Nowhere else is she talking about that. But that makes it a social thing. It's talking about hierarchies out there, right? So that empathy, which naturally comes in a poet's heart, and it gets articulated sometimes in an overt fashion also, but sometimes just subtly suggests what the larger aspect of whatever she or he is saying, it comes out. So I think Anarkali is one. And also, there are other poems where, in fact, Menopause, the poem that you are, which you referred to, Deepa, even there, I mean, this whole process of the aging of a woman, the way it has been captured. And I know that there are 50%, if not more, the percentage of, of women folk. How do you cope with the process of aging? It's a beautiful kind of a poem to nudge you into thinking about that. As to what is this aging doing? And I think she's using a very beautiful, homely kind of a metaphor, and that is that of chapati. You know, she's using the heap of stale chapatis that rise up. Now that in itself invokes in one the entire idea of what is a woman seeking in that age. Menopause is obviously just a womanly thing. It's not, a man is not included in this experience, right? So I think the choice of the subject and the way she narrates it, and I would say that these are not parallel things, Deepa, for you writing for a child or for an adult or whatever. I think one informs the other. you know the range of imagination that you seem to sort of exercise in terms of finding the right similes and metaphors and so on, I think that has something to do, and the narrativity, the sequential thing that comes in. How do you tell a story through a poem? Invoking the curiosity of the reader, that also has something to do with your storytelling for children. you know so it gets combined, and it just so happens that yes,
Hi,
there are
Sukrita.
two different genres.
There
So-
are all three of you. There are wonderful questions coming into the box. So I thought we could address some of them, and I could give it to each of you as I see them being pertinent to what you were just saying. For instance, picking up a thread from where Sukrita was talking about the idea of difficult experiences like menopause, the social purpose of poetry. Here is a question which maybe Sangeeta would like to address by Veena Gandhi, who says,
Okay.
through poetry, we can express our inner sentiments and views. Moreover, can be explored the history of the lives of the society. So, Sangeeta, would you like to briefly take it up? There are loads of questions, and I would love to be able to bring all of that up within the next 15 minutes that we have.
I am glad to see that we have invoked people's heart to ask questions. All credit to Deepa and to the panel. I would answer this to Veena. Actually, what is a sentiment? What is an emotion? People who are more observant and who can see, a poet is a person who can see minor details of things, and the way we perceive things, maybe it is ignored by others. It may not be worth a while to see those incidents which are happening around us in nature, inside us. Sometimes the way we perceive a writer or a poet or a creative person sense of perception is very different. I like to say that sentiments, emotions, I would say, I would rather say sensitivity. Sensitivity is of a different kind. It is very fine, fine tuned in poets, in writers, in artists, in filmmakers, all creative people. Their sensitivity is very, very fine tuned. We can see things which others may not see or perceive at all. So that's why we are moved more intensely than others. So that is the reason why a poet, when writes something, or a poem is narrated, then it moves others also, because it has already moved the poet. So that is the reason why when we write, or we say something, it is appealing to others. Thank you, Veena, for this question. I hope I have made some sense to in the answer.
Between the panelists and the wonderful audience that we have today. Here is a question or an observation from Mandira Ghosh saying poetry is cathartic outpouring of sensitive souls. Deepa, I would be happy if you took it up, but I'm also going to add my own footnote, which is what I had in mind for the next round, which is to say that romantic love is a very important part of poetic expression. And romantic love, as each of you has put through in your remarks and in your own work, can go either way. It can be something beautiful, transcendental. It can also be something that is horrific and violent. So, what happens in these sort of situations where Mandira is saying the cathartic outpouring of sensitive soul? The sensitive soul could be somebody who's suffering, or the sensitive soul could be somebody who's ecstatic. So, Deepa, you have lots of poems about love, the possibilities as well as the disillusionment. So, would you like to take up Mandira Ghosh's observation from that point of view of what happens with, say, the love poetry that you have in your collection?
Thank you, Nandini, for that observation. Definitely, Sangeeta also mentioned it, that poetry is a kind of catharsis, writing poetry. And, it is the outpouring of a sensitive soul, rightly said. But yeah, as Mala said, it can be a celebration, it can be a joyful outpouring, but it it can also be, the lament of a person who's disappointed, who has had greater expectations, than have been fulfilled. So there are always, both aspects of different aspects of love poetry. And okay, in some of my poems, I have mentioned, and even like Anarkali, as Suprita rightly said, Anarkali is about the celebration of love, but it's also about how love can be, entomb a woman. So that is something that it is something that I feel is important to give expression in your poetry, because a lot of the time, people have this idea that love poetry is also, is just about, souls sighing for each other, or the praising the beauty of the lover, or whatever, the ecstasy of love. But then there is the aspect, the the disappointed lover. And I feel, to balance these emotions, it's very important to examine this wonderful emotion that binds human beings, and see, is romantic love really that romantic? The young girls, they love to read romances, and they're taken up by Mills and Boone and all that, and often they don't see beyond, the tall, dark, handsome man they were expecting to find. So, you see, I feel it's important to express the other aspect that, oh, yeah, it's wonderful to be in love. But the fact is, there is also disillusionment. And I'm sorry to be cynical, but that's what life is about.
Deepa, there is a request from several people that you read a poem to illustrate or to this point, or some aspect of this sentiment, emotion, love, whatever you'd like to choose.
The love poem part.
Whichever one to illustrate what you're saying.
Okay. I have to just take a minute to search it. Okay, I'll read a few lines from this poem. Love, that flighty gin. I would have liked to live forever within the opaque glass walls of your love, seeing the world through misty eyes, the sun's heat softly tempered to my back, the rain a distant, soothing patter, not a drenching torrent churning rivers of mud and slime to drown in. But the mist holds demons, their cries will not be stilled, and glass is fragile. Even a single stone, carelessly flung, can shatter the sanctuary we built, you and I, out of the power of our dreams. This vaporous castle, which can stand only till the magic lasts. So,
Request from Trisha Mahajan. So thank you, Trisha, for getting Deepa to read one more poem. The next one, and possibly we just need a short answer here to Sukrita, please. Sukrita, this is from Binay Bhushan Thakur, who says very important discussion on the process of creation of poetry. And I'm requesting Sukrita to talk a bit about it because she's written a great deal on the creative process. So over to you.
Um, I think that's primarily what I've been speaking on today, Mindy, particularly in the context of Deepa, because she also, like many other poets, she also has in this volume itself several poems which are to do with writing poetry, and what is poetry, trying to define that, and also trying to define as to what the past means to a poet, to her as a poet. And before I say anything else, I think one of the things that she talks about, which I'm very intrigued about, is that the past is a foreign country. You know, I think this is lovely because usually once past, you feel okay. I'm at home because it's my past, right? There is an ownership of that. But to say that, and that this is a very strange dimension that you are bringing out, Deepa. Do you realize it? I think it's something so beautiful when you say it's unfamiliar. Foreign. What is foreign about it? It's unfamiliar. So how are you digging the past? Because the more the time gap between the now and then, there is obviously the foreignness that is creeping into it. And I think to put your finger on that is very, very, very important. And that is the process of writing, because you are seeing what others are not very easily seeing at that point, right? So you are able to see as a poet that particular glint that comes into the flash that comes into the mind. Okay, but this past I thought was always mine. I know it all. But no, it's a foreign country. And you are an alien there. To be an alien to your own self, because after all, a series of pasts is what is you, isn't it? So I think this is the process. How is one exploring one's inner self? And you have one example I give, and then I'll stop at that. There's that beautiful poem. What is it called? Through the Looking Glass Darkly. It's so beautiful. On the one hand, it's the same. I mean, I'm coordinating this foreignness with this. You are looking at the mirror, but there is somewhere something hidden which you are not seeing. So, and then suddenly that insight comes later. So it always reminds one of, what is poetry? Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of emotion. We stop at that? No. It is when it is recollected in tranquility. So that's the example that you get here. Looking at the glass, okay, there is one image, immediate image that you see, but there is something behind it, right? And the mirror is speaking to you all the time, but it's not the same thing. The mirror is speaking different languages at different points of time to you about your own self, and that is what you discover in the mirror that is a poem. The poem itself becomes a mirror to me. That's the process, my dear. That is the process of poetry.
Rita, that's a big help. Last question there on the ticker, Trisha Mahajan. She puts it very nicely and in a rather intricate manner. It is difficult to write a word at times, and weaving words to write poetry par excellence needs patience, experience, and discipline. With a person undergoing so many things on an everyday basis, emotionally, mentally, etc., how to keep being in the same spirit? So let Deepa take that one. It's her day, her book, a question that I'm sure she would be very willing to answer, reveal the secrets of her wonderful creativity, and then I'll hand us back to the organizers. Over to you, Deepa.
Okay. Thank you so much, Trisha, for this wonderful question. That's absolutely true. It's it's very difficult to write, uh, being so many different people doing different chores, wearing many hats. And how do you said get into the same spirit? Well, we don't get into the same spirit. That is the whole thing about the shifting perspective. And yes, your mind can get clogged with the daily clutter of life, the clutter of existence. But then sometimes that is where the inspiration often springs, and you have to set aside. You have to fight for time. And I have written poems while waiting somewhere for somebody, sitting in an airport, for example, or just waiting for somebody to meet somebody in an office. That is the time when you are away from that daily clutter. And that is the time when you can, if you just start, put a few words on paper, your thoughts will begin to flow. So you have to seize the moment. That's what, a lot of us poets do. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Thank you, Deepa, and very grateful indeed to KLF for bringing all of us together on this panel. Thank you, Sukrita and Sangeeta, for your views, and wishing Forgotten Kaleidoscopes a great and large, insightful readership. So it's been a wonderful talking to all of you, and I just hand the panel back to the organizers at the Kalinga Literature Festival. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So it was indeed a wonderful session. So on behalf of Kalinga Literary Festival Organizing Committee, I'm thankful to all of you to come in our session and made our evening such a memorable one. So, and I'm also thankful to our viewers who have seen these things. And this particular link will be there in the YouTube and Facebook forever. And we will be requesting to all of our viewers to watch again, spread it more and more for the larger audience. So it is a wonderful discussion to have such luminaries of Indian poetry with us today. So thank you so much, ma'am, again. And we will be having such kind of, this sessions time and again in our Kalinga Literary Festival, Bhava Samvad. So thank you so much, ma'am, again.
Thank you.